Good morning and welcome again to Hordle Tiptoe chat time. As we record this, we've got a bit of blue sky outside, so God's creation truly is coming to life. Snowdrops are out, daffodils are coming, and God reminds us through his creation that he never, ever forsakes us. With me this morning is Jason Garrett, Senior Resilience Officer with the charity World Vision. I'm really going to just leave it to Jason to explain his position with World Vision and what the charity does. My attention was drawn to them from my Bible study notes back in about November of last year, when I read one morning about a reforestation project in sub-Saharan Africa, which was helping farmers there and improving the ecology of the area. And I thought, what a wonderful, positive story when there's so much negativity around. So I got in touch with World Vision, and Jason very kindly has come to talk to us. Jason, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. A bit chilly where you are in Leamington, I know. This is Lymington, and it's also pretty chilly, but spring is coming. Creation is waking up. Can you tell us your story? Tell us a bit about what you do with World Vision, about the charity, and carry on to any other things that you want to. Welcome. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jason.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you and to talk about my experiences and about World Vision and the work it does. So I've been with World Vision for a little bit over 14 years, about 14 and a half years. I've had a few different roles in that time, but yes, the last few years I've been a resilience advisor. So that means that I work with colleagues in our office here in the UK and in various countries across the world, in Africa, Asia, a bit of Latin America as well, really to help design and manage projects that help people to build resilience. And what we mean by that really is to make sure that, well, their livelihoods in particular. So often that's agriculture. A lot of the time we work with farmers, but maybe other things as well that people do to earn a living and earn a livelihood, to make those more secure, particularly in the face of things like climate change and disasters. So various ways in which people can cope better with all of those kind of shocks and challenges that they face. I think sometimes we get the feeling that disasters are things that just happen and there's nothing that can be done about it, whereas actually a lot of the time we can kind of expect things to happen or anticipate. I mean, here in the UK, we get flooding on a regular basis, but we kind of know roughly when it's going to happen. And some people, are worse affected than others, particularly if they are more vulnerable. If the particular place they happen to live, is on a floodplain or whatever. And so it's much the same in other parts of the world too. And so building resilience is really about kind of strengthening systems and helping people to protect themselves from those kind of disasters like floods or droughts or storms or things like earthquakes. Again, we often think of earthquakes as causing great devastation, but they don't necessarily always have to. If people live in homes or work in buildings that are built strongly and properly to withstand earthquakes, and actually the damage can be quite limited, whereas in other places where perhaps those standards aren't there, then an earthquake can cause absolute devastation, as we do sometimes see. So yeah, what I do is I work with colleagues around the world to make sure that our projects are doing what they can to support people to build their own resilience. And so that's kind of working with communities and community groups, but also making sure that they're working with local authorities, local government systems to make everything work more effectively to do that. So that can be helping to write project proposals that we send to donors like the British government or the EU or parts of the UN to get funding, or visiting when possible projects to see how they're getting on and giving advice and input. And also helping to kind of collate the lessons that we learn from all of that so that we can continue to improve what we do and sharing that with other people as well. Well, at the moment, because later in the year, we've got the big climate change conference here in the UK in Glasgow, COP26 as it's known. So, and climate change is it's having lots and lots of impacts in various ways, but one of them is that it is making those kind of disaster events more extreme and more frequent, really. So it's harder for people to recover from them. So it's getting increasingly important that things are done to stop that getting worse and worse. So I'm involved with a few people around the World Vision Global Partnership to see how we can try and influence some of the things that are happening in the run up to that meeting and during that time as well in November, later in the year.
So Jason, World Vision, my understanding is that World Vision, you're a Christian organisation.
That's right.
Yeah. Can you tell us something about the history? I'm aware of it, but I really know very little. I did actually Google it to obviously find a little bit more before I contacted your organisation, contacted you. But could you just share with us, because I expect there'll be quite a lot of our listeners who won't really know a lot about World Vision, but I mean, you are a very large organisation and you're doing some pretty big things in the world, aren't you? Would you like to just sort of share a bit of that with us now?
Yeah, I certainly will do. Yeah, and some of the history of the organisation is quite interesting as well. So,
please do, yeah. Thank you.
We're a Christian organisation and we're a child-focused organisation. So we're particularly wanting to support the most vulnerable children in the most kind of dangerous places around the world. But that doesn't mean that we only work with children. We often talk about what we call the ecology of the child. So there's the child themselves, the family that they're part of, the community they're part of, and then the kind of the wider nation and international issues. So we will address different things at different levels to support children and their families and communities, and trying to improve child well-being is what we're aiming to do. And we do that from our Christian faith, but we don't just work with Christians. We work with people of all faiths and none, but we do that out of the love that comes from our Christian faith and as a demonstration of that.
Wonderful.
And World Vision has been going for about 70 years.
Really?
Works in about 100 countries, just slightly under, across the world. So we have what we call support offices, like in the UK, that raise a lot of the funding and do some of the kind of campaigning and policy influencing and advocacy work. So that would include other places in Europe, so World Vision Germany, World Vision Switzerland, for example, and then we have an office in Canada and the US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, all kinds of places.
Really. Yeah.
And then lots of countries throughout Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, a little bit of Eastern Europe still, and Asia and the Pacific as well. So we're pretty widespread. And there's various different ways of measuring these things, but we're probably one of the largest child-focused organisations around the world. And our origins are quite interesting. There was a man, an American guy called Robert Pierce, who was an evangelist and a preacher and a kind of missionary. And in the kind of post-war years, in the 1940s and early 50s, he had these big kind of preaching events that he would do in the States, and then he started traveling around the world, particularly to Southeast Asia, because I suppose in those days there was a lot of things going on around China and Korea and all those kind of places, and so he would have these big events where he would preach the gospel, and many people came to faith. And then there was one occasion, I think it was in Korea, though the story sometimes gets a little confused exactly where it was, but he'd been in this place before and he had come back, and apparently this was like the day before he was due to be traveling back home to the States, and he was at a school or a place where he was talking, and a girl came up to him and said, when you were here before, I came and heard you speak, and I decided to become a Christian, to commit my life to Christ because of what you had to say. And she said, then I went home and told my family, and they weren't very happy at all, and they've kind of basically kicked me out of home because of me, doing what you said, kind of thing. So this girl said to him, so what are you going to do about it? And he realised that there were implications in sharing the Christian faith, that it can mean I mean, you know, it can mean all kinds of things, but it can put people into very difficult situations as well. So he was working through, I think it was a Christian school, or there were nuns or whatever there. So he pulled out the kind of remaining $20 note or something that he had in his pocket and said to this nun, well, can you take that and buy whatever she needs or look after her? And then he went back to the States, and then he kind of, reflecting on that, realized that actually, if you are going to be asking people to convert to Christianity, particularly in places where perhaps it's not the majority religion, then you also need to commit to helping those people, because you're likely to end up in quite difficult situations. So he then continued to support this particular girl whose name was White Jade. And then that kind of developed the idea of child sponsorship, which is still how World Vision gets a lot of its funding. And then that kind of developed into, I suppose, as those years progressed into the 1950s, there were civil wars in places like Korea, there were all the issues in China and around Southeast Asia. And so doing kind of humanitarian aid and then longer term development work started, and that was kind of where World Vision started from. And there's a story also of Bob Pierce, of, as he was in these parts of the world, seeing you know, a lot of the conditions that people were living in, kind of got down on his knees to pray, as he did every night or whatever, and prayed the now kind of quite well-known prayer of saying, let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. And that's kind of the inspiration for the organisation, something that we still hold on to very tightly, really, you know, as a Christian organisation. But it's also the case that we work in places that some places that have a very strong Christian heritage and strong Christian faith, and others that are dominated by other faiths. And we don't hide away from the fact that we're a Christian organisation, but we work very closely with people of other faiths. In lots of countries, many of our staff will be from other faiths, because that will be the majority faith of the organisation. But they, many of them very much enjoy working with an organisation that is a faith-based organisation, even if it's different from theirs, because of the values that we have. And although we don't proselytise necessarily, we do see how we operate and the things we do as being expressions of our faith. And we do actually kind of make use of our faith basis in some of the work we do, because, as I said, you know, most of the communities where World Vision works, faith is a very large part of people's outlook and way of life. And so we work with faith leaders and people of faith to kind of use stories of faith, whether it's the Christian faith or others, and the kind of values that come from it to kind of influence change. So, for example, we have an approach that we call Channels of Hope, that started a number of years ago, around the time when HIV and AIDS was a big problem in lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, now it's much kind of better managed, though, you know, still a challenge. And what we recognised was that a lot of churches were taking quite a judgmental approach, as I think we've all seen, you know, here and in other places as well. Whereas a lot of people in their congregations were HIV positive and were perhaps struggling to be open about that, and so were not getting the kind of support they might need. And so this Channels of Hope kind of curriculum, in a sense, was developed that looked at various parts of the Bible, various stories of the Bible, to work with faith leaders around issues of kind of compassion and care for people in your community, and that kind of, you know, not judging others kind of approach. And that has been transformative, really, in many places, of seeing churches that had a very negative attitude and church leaders having very negative attitudes to changing completely, to now being much more supportive of people with HIV in their communities, and making sure that there is, you know, proper care taking of people, and communities helping, supporting people who are HIV positive, and feeding into the systems that there now are in a lot of places, where the antiretroviral drugs that people can take to keep themselves healthy are all working well. And so since then, we've moved, we've taken that approach and used it to look at other issues around kind of gender issues and kind of violence, things like that. And we used it very successfully in Sierra Leone a few years ago when there was the Ebola pandemic. And that was interesting as well, because Sierra Leone has a large Christian population, but is majority Muslim. It's about 60-40% or 70-30 or something like that. And one of the issues was that obviously Ebola is a very nasty disease, and you need to be extremely careful. So when people died of Ebola, the kind of medical people came along and took the bodies away and wrapped them up, and was very, very, very careful to not spread the disease. But a lot of people were finding that it was done in a very kind of cold manner, really. And our national director at the time was visiting another part of Sierra Leone on other work, but was in a conversation with somebody who said to him, well, why would we let our relatives be taken away and kind of thrown into the ground like dogs or something like that? And he realized that there needed to be some kind of dignified process of the safe burials, and adding some kind of ceremony around it that added dignity but also kept it safe. So we developed that, and also used the Channels of Hope approach to work in both churches and mosques to teach people around a lot of the issues around cleanliness and hygiene and sanitation to avoid the spread of the disease. And in Sierra Leone, actually the two communities, the Muslims and Christians, get on pretty well. And so we actually had church pastors speaking in mosques, and we had imams speaking in churches to kind of show that the good relationship there are between the two, and the fact that it wasn't...
We've got to praise the Lord for that in itself, haven't we?
Exactly, yeah. It was a great witness, and it showed that the disease affected people of any faith. So, so we... Although we, we're not kind of imposing our faith on anybody, but we make use of faith because it means that people will see all those issues within their own kind of context and culture and their own understanding of the world, which means they will actually take a lot of those things more on board than perhaps if you come with a much more kind of secular point of view.
Yeah. So again, it really seems to me, and in fact, a recent speaker, Ollie Stanley from our Basics Bank, was talking about this, and I said, well, it's the hands and feet of Christ. And again, your organisation on a much bigger, much larger, the hands and feet of Christ again, which is what we're called to do. It's a wonderful example. Talking about hope, can I just bring you back to that particular pointer that I picked up on, which was this reforestation. Can you talk us through that? It just really it was such a bright moment. It was November. I think that we were just about to enter into another lockdown again, grey, dismal day. You look around, the news headlines are as they are, doom and gloom, Captain Mannering everywhere. And we know that there is good news around. I mean, for a start, there's good news of Christ, but this is, again, the hands and feet of Christ, but it seems such a positive message. Can you just share us a little bit with that? Because there's so many wonderful things you're sharing with us. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's that part of their work is one of the things that I get quite passionate about, really. So yeah, I mean, I suppose
you get passionate for us. That's great.
That kind of good news part of it, I suppose, is a kind of the opposite side of what is a kind of, in many ways, a bad news story of the great deforestation that is occurring in lots of parts of the world. Things like the Amazon rainforest and other places. We're seeing that, and of course we're all aware of the impact that has in terms of environmental degradation and climate change. And in recent years, there has been a lot of discussion around the need to grow more trees, plant trees, to kind of absorb some of that excess carbon to try and limit climate change. And it's great often to see movements around tree planting, but it's not always, as is often the case, it's not quite as simple as all of that. Now, for us in the UK, planting trees is probably a perfectly good thing to do and works quite well. But we're lucky that we live in a place, well, I say lucky, I was going to say we live in a place with plenty of rain. We don't always feel lucky.
I was wondering about that one, yeah.
But you see, the thing with a tree, particularly if you plant a seedling, which is often what's done, a little tree is started in a nursery or something, and then it's planted in the ground, and it's fairly small and thin and weak, and it has a very small root. So when you plant it, you need to keep watering it because it hasn't got the root system down to the water table yet. Now we can do that. We can water things. So we've got plenty of water. It rains. That's fine. In other parts of the world where it's much drier, so lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but some parts of Asia as well, where it's dry, you plant seedlings, and the chances are they're actually not going to grow into full trees before they die, because they haven't been able to get to the water table and to really get all those nutrients that the tree needs. So again, this is a story that goes back a number of years, this time to an Australian rather than an American, a man by the name of Tony Ronaldo, who works for World Vision Australia, has done for about 20 years. And back in the 1980s, he was working in Niger in West Africa, just north of Nigeria, in that kind of sub-Saharan or Saharan kind of part of West Africa. He was working for a mission, SIM, I think it was called, and he was working on forestry and trying to do work around reforestation and finding that struggle that you plant trees and they just don't take because the conditions aren't right for it. And he was driving along, and I think he was getting to the point where he was feeling as though it was all a bit of a waste of time, really. And I think stopped his vehicle in the middle of somewhere. I'm not sure whether there was a problem or whether he just wanted to brake, and was looking around at this, what seemed like a fairly barren landscape and no trees. And then he noticed these little bushes that were around. And what would happen would be generally farmers would cut those bushes down because farmers have been told, particularly from a kind of more Western style agriculture, to have clear fields with no trees so you can plant nice even crops and things. And so if any bushes came up, farmers would cut them back. And Tony suddenly realized that those weren't bushes, those are actually trees. And they were trees that had been there before and had been cut down at the ground level. Now, again, here in the UK, quite often when you remove a tree, you might, take the root out as well. But that's a big task and quite expensive to do. You might need equipment or lots of people to do it. So in poorer parts of the world, you would just cut the tree down at the ground level. So the root system is still there. And if it had been a big tree, it's got a pretty big root system. So that root is still getting water and nutrients out of the soil deep down. And so trying to regrow, but because it's a big stump, lots and lots of little shoots will grow up and just becomes a clump of bushes, which really on its own isn't an awful lot of good and probably won't go very far. So what Tony realized is, and it's probably a case of rediscovering something that people did many, many years ago, but he realized that if you cut all of those shoots, apart from maybe 2 or 3, 4 or 5, then the energy from the root will go into just a small number of shoots, which will then grow much quicker. And if you carry on pruning, I think the technical term is coppicing for any tree growers or farmers out there. So then it grows back much more quickly, and you can have a tree regrown within a couple of years from a stump down at the ground level if you are managing that process and cutting and pruning. So the trees grow back much quicker than planting a seedling. And not only that, because you're able to prune it, it means a farmer has access to what they pruned off, the wood, which could be used as fuel, because obviously a lot of people in Africa in particular still use wood fires for cooking, or it can be used as fodder for animals, or whatever it might be. So those trees grow back much more quickly and much cheaper, really, because you're not buying anything. You need a good knife and an understanding of the technique, but that's basically all you need. And so he developed this idea of doing this, and it's known now as farmer managed natural regeneration, or FMNR, which is quite a mouthful, and I do think we ought to come up with a better name. Yes, but it's because it is. It's regenerating trees, which is a natural process, but it's the farmer is managing that natural process. So that's why it's given that name. But regreening or regenerating is the kind of the idea. And so it has the advantage that those trees grow back much more quickly. Yeah. It's likely that they are going to be more kind of indigenous trees because it's based on what was there before. It's also probably quite likely that you will get quite a range of trees being regrown. And so what that does is, so if a farmer is doing that in his field, he may not necessarily regrow every tree stump there is, he will select a few. But what that does for a farmer is that it creates some shade, which in very hot parts of the world is quite helpful. There's lots of plants like coffee, for example, that tend to grow best with some shade.
All right.
It means that if they're fruit trees, then the farmer then has access to that fruit, which is obviously very good for the diet and good for children particularly. As the leaves fall off or as it's pruned and things, then some of that kind of organic matter can land on the soil and rot down into the soil and improve the soil quality. But one of the main things is trees, because of the root system and everything, help the soil to absorb water and hold water much more effectively than very dry land. So when the rains come, you don't have it all wash away and take the topsoil off. It gets absorbed into the soil more, and sometimes the trees can help in kind of deflecting some of that rain so it falls a little bit more gently. And so all of that helps to improve the quality of the soil. And then also with a variety of trees, you get a little bit more in the way of insect life or bird life. And all of that kind of adds to the biodiversity, adds to the quality of the soil and everything around it. Which means that farmers can actually grow, be more productive in terms of what else they're growing. There's a story just recently we got from, there's a community in southwest Kenya in a place called Niatike, where World Vision has been working for a number of years. And it's an area that's not too far from Lake Victoria and kind of the border of Tanzania and Uganda. So it does get a fair amount of rain, but what it gets is quite a lot of flooding as well. Right. And these days, long periods of dry weather and then quite short periods of heavy rain, which is another impact of climate change. And so it's not an easy place for people struggling with maybe small plots of land to try and grow enough food for themselves and their families. Yeah. So there's a story about a little boy called Naaman and his mother, Pamela, who was widowed. So on her own and struggling to grow enough food in the plot of land that they had to feed Naaman and the rest of the family. And Naaman noticed that their neighbour, a man called Peter, was able to grow much more productively on his land. And he had trees as well as crops growing on his piece of land. So Naaman started speaking to Peter, and Peter had been trained in farmer-managed natural regeneration by the World Vision Project. And so he then passed that on to Peter, explained what it was all about, not to Peter, to Naaman, he was Peter. So he passed all that information on. And so Naaman started doing the same thing on their land. And so he's now, or he and his mother are now able to grow much more food. They've almost doubled the amount of food they can grow. Right. And they've got access to fruit as well, from regrowing fruit trees. And are now working with a piece of land that's got much, much better quality soil as well. So their prospects in the future are even better. So that's kind of shows how it's a technique that is quite simple to understand and can be passed on from one person to another without necessarily always having to be World Vision that does that. We do training, but then it's passed on.
It seems to me there are a number of wins. I mean, the first thing is that the cost, there's no cost, it's purely management. But one of the crucial things, it seems to me, is that you can go to people and say, doing this is beneficial for you. It's no good. And here I suppose I get on a soapbox, but it is no good just dictating to people about how they should or should not manage their lives, because everyone has to survive for the day before they can cope with tomorrow. But that's what appealed to me when I read about this, was just sort of the whole thing was, well, I'm careful with this term win-win situation, but it obviously is a very, very positive situation. Before we started, so excuse me a moment. Before we started recording, we were talking just a little bit about the Global Climate Conference in November. We've already heard a little bit about that, as I was saying to Jane Boswell with Tear Fund. And I feel sort of prompted to ask questions and to raise this with our congregation here. And also I think it's something that the Christian community should be aware of in general. Do you have any thoughts and any comments about this? And presumably World Vision will be supporting it. World Vision will be having some input, because you obviously must have the ear of, I don't know, United Nations level or an organization of your size and success. I guess you've got some fairly influential ears, have you?
We have. I probably should be fairly honest and confess that this issue, climate change, is something that we have been fairly quiet on for a number of years. You mentioned Tear Fund. They've been absolutely fantastic in talking about these issues amongst the church for many years and more publicly. It's something that we've kind of focused on what we do at the community level, our projects that help people to adapt to climate change.
But you're coming at it really from a slightly different angle, aren't you? You're actually on the ground. It seems to me you're on the ground dealing with the practical side, helping people to overcome what's happening, aren't you?
We are, yeah. And Tear Fund do a lot of that as well. And I think we've realised that we do need to talk about it as well, because, the impact on children are extremely vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation in all kinds of ways. There's we did a report, a piece of research last year looking at the links between climate change and violence against children, and there's a lot of evidence that child marriage in particular is increasing in places that are affected by kind of climate change disasters. Because if people lose what they've got to a flood or a drought, and those are becoming more frequent because of climate change, sometimes they're left in very difficult situations, and girls particularly can be married off early to put less pressure on the family. But of course it can have an extremely negative impact on those girls. But families are often left in a situation where they have got very few choices, because somebody might
live for the day, haven't they, before they can live tomorrow.
Exactly. Yeah. So and if people have to move somewhere, they're displaced again because of some kind of climate-related disaster, then that again disrupts children's education and can maybe force children to be put out to work. In some and some of the worst kind of forms of child labour is something that the World Vision is very concerned about. So we're beginning to see more clearly the connections between things like climate change and environmental issues, and some of those other issues around child protection that we've been campaigning on for a number of years. So we are now speaking much more kind of publicly around climate change and how we need to do things about it. And, so working with and supporting people like Tear Fund, who've been doing it for a long time. So yes, like you say, there's COP26, as it's called, the climate change meetings in November in Glasgow. So we're currently kind of looking at what we need to do to try and influence what comes out of that, both here in the UK and in other countries as well. One of the things that we're quite keen on trying to ensure is that at the moment there's no role for children at COP26. Now, we all have heard of Greta.
I was going to say Greta would be there, I'm sure. So,
Well, technically, she's not a child anymore because she's 18.
No, I suppose not. No.
So she's there's a certain amount of youth involvement, but there are children around the world, not just Greta. She's been fantastic, and she really has raised the profile. But there have been children in other places, including places like Kenya and Uganda and other places where World Vision works. The children have been doing similar kind of work to raise the issue, because it's their future that they see, and they see the challenges that are coming. So
they're the ones that have got to make it change, aren't they?
Exactly. So we recently did a consultation exercise. So we spoke to children in a number of countries around the world to ask what they thought about climate change, what they thought needs to be done, what their views were. So we got a little report that you might be able to find. I'm not sure whether it's on. It was done by World Vision International, so it's somewhere on a website somewhere. I could probably send you the link.
That's right.
Share with people. But those children's voices aren't necessarily going to be represented at COP26. So we would really like to see the chance for children to have a presence or have their voices heard at that conference, because it is important that children get.
Your organisation needs our prayers in that direction, then, don't you? So
exactly.
you bring it back again to this focus on children, and through children, then you can help to change the whole thing.
That's right. Yeah. So prayers for that, and maybe if anybody speaks to their MP or writes to their MP, then they could perhaps mention that kind of thing as well. Okay. And one of the other key things is there's a growing movement, as we said before, about things like planting trees and what we call nature-based solutions. So solutions to climate change that aren't about technology, aren't about chemicals or whatever, but are about using the force of nature, as it were, or the way that nature works to try and mitigate some of those issues or solve some of those problems. So trees is part of that, but other things as well. And so we want to make sure that does get a proper profile, but also that it's done genuinely in a way that actually promotes biodiversity. Because one of the other issues around trees and tree planting that we think generally our approach to regenerating tends to avoid is that it's very easy to think, oh, well, let's plant lots of trees and let's plant all of the same trees, that's nice, quick and easy. And then you have a plantation of the same variety of trees, and all that does is suck the same stuff out of the ground and not put anything back in again. Right. And you don't get the biodiversity that you need. So if you think about a rainforest, for example, the Amazon, there's so many different plants and creatures and things going on there that they all support and help each other. Yeah. And one of the ironic things in some ways about the Amazon is that it's been cut back and cut down largely for agriculture to grow often things like soya that is used to feed animals that then are used to feed us in meat in Western countries. But what you find is that you cut down the rainforest and actually the ground is not really very fertile. Because it's the biodiversity that creates the fertility. You get rid of that, and the soil is actually fairly poor quality. So the trouble is, you grow soya or whatever it is for a few years, and again you've depleted the soil, and so more chemicals are added. But eventually, you then have to cut down more of the forest to create more land to grow crops on, because the land you just used isn't any good. And so it's this self-defeating thing, really. So looking at really genuine ways of using nature to find solutions to climate change, but that create biodiversity and are in the interests of local communities as well, is certainly another important factor.
It's raising an awareness of this before ever, and finding the ways, as you sort of found with the trees, of actually making it profitable, making it worthwhile for the people involved. So, Jason, I'm going to say thank you very much. I mean, it's fascinating what your organisation is involved with, and I really do thank you very much for sharing so much with you. I mean, obviously there is a massive amount that World Vision is involved with, and it's a wonderful story behind it. Lovely to have such a positive story too. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us sort of just opening a little bit into what your involvement is. We do thank you. From my garden office to your garden office, I see my garden office cat arrived just now. If you notice something moving there, he comes and goes as he wants to. But I do thank you very much indeed. And may the Lord be with you. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much as well.